Okay, welcome. My name is Debbie Keener, and I'm the head of marketing and special projects here at the Oceanside Library. I would like to introduce my colleague and fellow presenter this evening, adult service librarian Ellen Berg. So we encourage everyone, please go to our website and go to pagingoceanside.com to learn more about the library's Author Spotlight program and the fantastic lineup that we have planned for this year and for our summer reading. So definitely go to pagingoceanside.com and see what we have planned. If you're part of a book club, again, go to pagingoceanside.com and sign up, and you'll get some special promotions for your book club. And lastly, Ellen and I would like to thank our director, Chris Mara, our assistant director, Tony Iovino, as well as the board of directors for Oceanside Library. We would like to thank our fantastic colleagues for giving us the support and the opportunity to bring programs like this to the Oceanside community. We couldn't do this without everyone's support, so we want to thank them. So, Ellen, take it away.
Okay, without further ado, it is time to begin our program. Tonight's guest is author Lynda Cohen Loigman. Lynda grew up in Long Meadow, Massachusetts. She received a BA in English and American Literature from Harvard College and a JD from Columbia Law School. Her debut novel, Two Family House, was a USA Today bestseller and a nominee for the Goodreads 2016 Choice Awards in historical fiction. Her second novel, The Wartime Sisters, was selected as a Women's World Book Club pick and a Best Book of 2019 by Real Simple magazine. Lynda will be presenting to us now about Wartime Sisters. Welcome, Lynda.
Thank you so much for having me. Hi, everybody. I just want to thank you all at the library. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you guys tonight. I think I told Ellen before that I've been just doing a lot of Zooms lately, and it's been such a nice thing. It's been such a great distraction for me to talk to people during the pandemic. And I hope that we all just, it's nice for everyone to come together and feel included. And we can't go to library events right now in person. I guess you guys can go to your library though. So that's a good thing. It's nice to have these book talks virtually, even if we can't have them in person. What I'm going to do when I talk about this book, The Wartime Sisters, I actually have a PowerPoint presentation and I'm going to share it with all of you in a second. I'm going to share my screen so you can see it. I have a lot of different photographs from the archives of the Springfield Armory, and they're a lot of fun to look at, and they kind of help me explain to you how this story came about. So I'm kind of taking you on a little trip inside my head, whether for better or for worse, to tell you kind of how this story came to be, what the inspiration for it was, the sort of family stories behind it. And then I'm going to show you what I saw at the Springfield Armory and sort of the research that I did through the photographs. So I'm going to share my screen now and put this on, let's see, on the right view so you can see it. Okay, here we go. So when I first started thinking about writing a second book, if any of you have read my first book, The Two Family House, then you know that story was set in Brooklyn in a two-family house. And the inspiration for the setting for that story really came from my mother's childhood, from her family. She grew up in Brooklyn in this house on the second floor, and she had two sisters. And my grandmother's brother lived downstairs, and he had three daughters also. So there were three girls, my grandmother's three girls upstairs, and my great uncle's three girls downstairs. And they all really, they were a very close family. They were constantly up and down the stairs, being with each other. But that when my mother turned 18, her family moved to Springfield, Massachusetts. And so when I was very young and I would hear these Brooklyn stories, they were always very lively and very colorful and full of, funny characters and the pickle man on the corner and, all kinds of just fun laughter and bright, anecdotes that my mom and her sisters had. when they moved to Springfield, the stories that were told about those Springfield years, I always say were told in the language of loss, because my grandmother and my mother and her sisters, they left everybody behind in Brooklyn. So they moved from this big city to a smaller one. And they left all of their family. They left all of their friends. Even though Springfield was not, really in the middle of nowhere, they felt like it was. They felt like they had been sort of relegated to the North Pole. They felt exiled. And when I was little, my grandmother's brother used to come probably once a year. Every summer he would come from Brooklyn to visit on the train, and he thought he was coming to the country. He used to bring cans of tuna fish on the train because he thought that he would starve in the wilds of Western Massachusetts. So when I went to write a second book, I wanted to write about this sort of other phase in my mother's family history. And so part of that was the setting, and I wanted to explore those themes of sort of disappointment and having to start your life over. And I also found out something right before I started writing this book that I didn't know, which was that when my mother's family moved, my mom actually stayed behind in Brooklyn with her uncle and her cousins for a little while because it was her senior year of high school and she wanted to finish that up in Brooklyn. So she was left behind, which if you've read the Wartime Sisters, you know that my character Millie was left behind in Brooklyn while her sister moved to Western Massachusetts. So I was thinking about all of those themes. And then I had this other real, very important theme that I wanted to explore in this book, which was this idea of family roles. Because I really believe when we're young, we're sort of assigned roles in our families. This person is the caretaker, this person is the kind of klutzy one, this person is whatever they are. And I try to describe it, and I say, if you're at a Thanksgiving dinner and you're a little kid and you spill cranberry sauce on the white rug at your grandmother's house, everyone sitting around that table for Thanksgiving thinks of you as maybe klutzy, or maybe you were like, the Yiddish word would be a wilde chaya, a wild kid. And they might all kind of think of you that way from that incident that happened when you were little. And even when you're grown up, they might still talk about you that way. You could be 40 years old, you could be the most responsible, graceful person, and they're still talking about you like this wild, klutzy kid. That was something that I was just thinking a lot about, because my mom, as I said, was one of 3 sisters, and they all had their roles in their family that they played. And my whole life growing up, when they would get together, they would sort of fall into those patterns. So my mom was the oldest, and she was kind of the worrywart of the 3. The middle sister, my mother's middle sister, Barbara, was the optimist. And whenever they got together, she would, tell my mother not to worry and be very optimistic. And the younger one was a lot younger than my mom, 14 years younger than my mom. And so she was almost a different generation, and she was the fun one. So, everybody had their parts to play. But I used to think, what if they didn't really feel like being whatever part they were at a certain point in time? What if the fun one felt not so fun? What if the optimistic one was feeling not so optimistic? And so that was what I was thinking about too. So when I went to write this story, I had these themes in my head. I had the setting of Springfield, Massachusetts. I had one idea for a tiny, it was one character in the story. And my mother moved to Springfield in early 1960s, 1961, I think it was. And I had this idea that since it was Springfield, and I knew the Springfield Armory was this pretty important place in the city's history, I was going to have a character, an older woman, and she was going to have a backstory of working at the Springfield Armory. This was one little bit of my book. It was supposed to be maybe a page in the story. But even for one page in a story, I had to research the Springfield Armory just to figure out what job this woman would have even had if she had worked there during World War II. And when you start research like this, it can be a dangerous thing. I started researching the Armory. I found out so many fascinating things. And of course, because of what I found, I decided that I was going to set my story 20 years earlier than I had originally intended. So I still had this idea of sisters. All of those themes remained the same, but the time period changed. And it became a home front story set during World War II, but not about the war at all, really about these sisters and about the Armory. So you've all kind of seen things like this. These are just these sort of PR pieces that the War Commission would put out to try to encourage women to work during the war. and a lot of women worked at the Springfield Armory. When I first started researching it, I had this idea that the Armory was one building, and I could not have been more wrong. So this is a drawing from 1850. I thought the Armory maybe was started right before World War II. I thought it was much newer than it was and much smaller than it actually was. So the Armory actually started, George Washington commissioned it because after the Revolution, when we had to get so many weapons from France, when that war was over, he said, we really need to start making more weapons here. And so the Armory was commissioned. There were several armories in the country, that were commissioned that started producing weapons. But the Springfield Armory was one of them. So you can see from this picture that it's sort of set up like a campus. And when I went to visit it, that was the feeling that I really had. It has this campus feeling. The main arsenal building is still there. This is another, just a promotional kind of piece that they would put out. And this is from World War II. I think that WOW is the greatest acronym ever, but that's what they called the women who worked there because they were women ordnance workers at the Springfield Armory, and they called them WOW, which I thought was great. So this is just a photograph of one of the women working at the tables. And one of the things that was so interesting when I started doing this research was that I found a collection of recordings that someone had the great sense to put together in the 1980s. So they interviewed several women and men who worked at the Springfield Armory during World War II. And sadly, most of them have passed away at this point. But I listened to those recordings, and they were recordings, there were maybe 24 of them, and half of them were women. And even among those 12 women, they were really so representative of every kind of strata of society. So there was a woman who had worked at the Armory when she was 18 years old, and she was a single mother. She had a young child, and she went to work putting together triggers. And that sort of became the inspiration for my character of Millie, who also appears at the Armory and is a single mother and has a young child. And then I started sort of learning about what that meant to put together triggers at the Armory. But there was also a woman who was interviewed who was the wife of a commanding officer at the Armory. And that person became sort of my model for Lillian. The woman in the interview spoke about all of the kind of social responsibilities that she had as the wife of this commanding officer. So she would have parties at their home. I'm going to show you a picture of what the home looked like, because the Armory was not just a place where weapons were made, but people lived there. It was sort of part Army base. So of course the commanding officer lived there. And at any given time, maybe 30 or so officers would live there. Some of them had families, and some, many of them didn't, but there were several families living there. That woman, the commanding officer's wife, spoke about the greenhouses and the grounds and how beautiful they were, which again was so strange to me because I thought this was a place of, of factories and weapons, not a place with trees and greenhouses and gardens. But it was really a beautiful place. It sounded from the descriptions more like a country club. Someone else who had grown up there, whose father was an officer there, was interviewed, and she talked about the tennis courts that were there. There were 2 tennis courts during World War II, and someone else talked about the swimming pool. And, the more I would listen to these descriptions, the stranger it seemed, because what was this place? But those interviews that I listened to really helped me figure out that I wanted to set the story at the Armory, and also kind of the cast of characters that I might end up having. This is a great picture of messenger girls. So there were high school girls who were hired to run messages from one building to the other. There were so many buildings at the Armory. There were over 100 buildings. They were given numbers instead of names. So you would say, this is building 102, whatever it was. And so they hired these high school girls who would just kind of after school come and help out. This is just another, I love the faces of some of these women that you can see. So the grounds were such an important part of what I learned when I listened to those interviews. And it was just so fascinating to me. So this picture, I'm going to see if I can Can I move my mouse? I can. Okay, so you can see sort of that pointer that I have. So this part of the Armory was like a park, truly. And this is the part that I visited the whole thing, but this part really, all these dots are trees. And this is the main arsenal right here. But around the edges here and here were these beautiful homes. And I'm going to show you some pictures of them. That swimming pool that I talked about is right there. And the tennis courts are these orange rectangles. And over here is the commanding officer's house. So there was this very bucolic kind of setting that felt like a park, looked like a park. But then on this side of the street there were all the factories. And even here, these long gray buildings, there was a ballistics tunnel that they would test weapons out underground. And so it was this juxtaposition, really, of all of this natural beauty and then just this machinery of war forging onward and onward. And it just seemed like such, I mean, it was almost poetic to me and seemed like such a perfect setting for a story about opposites, because it was these two kind of opposite forces, right? Like all this park-like beauty and all the weaponry being made. And then I had these sisters who I was telling this story about, and the sisters are opposites as well. So Millie is the younger sister, and she is very beautiful and allowed, because of her beauty, because of her appearance, given certain liberties that her older sister does not have. Millie is allowed to be kind of more emotional and more flaky, and just she doesn't, her parents don't really hold her to the same standards of taking, you know, responsibility for herself that they hold her older sister to. So the older sister, Ruth, is much more cerebral. She's very academic. She's very responsible. Everything sort of falls on her shoulders. And so that creates tension between them. And their parents have certain expectations of both of them to play these certain roles forever and ever. And it becomes, the parents kind of contribute to the difficulty in their relationship. But when I kind of figured out exactly what the Armory looked like, and I saw this map, and I listened to those, those descriptions, it seemed to me that it was the perfect place for a story of conflict, because it seemed like the setting was almost in conflict with itself. So this picture is the commanding officer's house. So you can see how beautiful it is. I mean, you don't look at this picture and say, wow, that's an armory, or part of an armory, but it was, with all these trees and everything. These are some of the gardens and some of the walkways. So the Works Progress Administration was hired all of these gardeners to keep up the grounds at the Armory. And that was one of the ways that people were given jobs and created, that the government created jobs for people at home. These are just more pictures of those gardens. And back here, you can sort of see, this is the rose arbor that was really famous there, where just behind the commanding officer's house, where there were just all these beautiful roses blooming. So when I do this presentation in person, I put this slide up and I say, does anybody know who this is? And then people raise their hand. And this is a photo of Carole Lombard, and then you can see Carole Lombard with Clark Gable. But the reason that I put this photo up is because I like to talk about some of the research that I did that wasn't just about the Armory. So when you write a book of historical fiction, of course, I visited the Armory. Of course, I read everything I could about the Armory. I listened to these interviews. But you also, in order to really capture the time period and the sort of zeitgeist of what's going on in a book at a certain time, you research everything. You research the clothes that they're wearing, you research the food that they're eating. I always look for recipes. I look for newspaper articles. I look to see what movies are popular at the time and what music people are listening to. And certainly during the war, music was really important, and it became very important in this book. But at some point when I was doing that sort of pop culture research, I came across this story about Carole Lombard, and I didn't know it at all. I knew who she was. I didn't know she was married to Clark Gable, but I knew who she was. But Carole Lombard, right after the US entered the war, after Pearl Harbor was attacked in December of 1941, that January in 1942, Carol Lombard decided to go on a war bond drive. And she flew from, she was living in California and Hollywood, I think, and she flew to her home state of Indiana to do a war bond drive. And she raised $2 million in one night, which is like $34 million today. It was this enormous sum, and it was, you know, touted everywhere. And very tragically, on the way back, her plane crashed and she passed away. So this story I don't know, it was something about the story that really struck me, because I was looking for women's stories. And of course, I read all about the women and what they did at the Springfield Armory. But Carol Lombard, it seemed to me, really was almost she wasn't a soldier on the battlefield, but her death was because of the war, truly. I mean, she was sort of a casualty of war, and she made this sacrifice for her country. And when I read this story, and I was thinking about my character of Lillian and how I was going to describe her and what she looked like, and I sort of decided I was basing Lillian's physically, at least, on Carol Lombard. And of course, you know, she's a fairly complex character, so there's a lot of layers to her character. But physically, when I was thinking of Lillian, I was thinking of Carol Lombard. The other kind of side character in the story is this woman, Arietta, who is a singing cook at the Armory. When World War II started, there wasn't a cafeteria there, and of course, then eventually the Armory was running 24 hours a day. 7 days a week. There were 3 shifts every day. And so they started a cafeteria there just so that people wouldn't have to be always running out to get food. And in my research for the Armory, there was a line that I read in one of the books, and it was something like, women from every strata of society did their bit. There was a Gold Star mother who was a lathe operator. There was a teacher who was working nights doing X or Y. And then it said, and there was a famous opera singer who was a short order cook at the Armory cafeteria. And when I read that line, immediately just this image of a singing cook came into my head. And I thought it would be such a great character, and a lighter character also, because you know, it's the sisters in the story have so much conflict between them. Lillian has a very complicated and, you know, there's darkness to her backstory. And I wanted this character of Arietta to be a sort of lighter character and fun. And she is. She was one of my favorite parts to write about this book. But I decided not to make her an opera singer. I decided that I was going to make her sort of a former vaudeville singer instead. So this is a picture of Sophie Tucker, who was a pretty famous vaudeville singer. And I was sort of thinking about Sophie when I was writing the character of Arietta. And this is Sophie Tucker. This is a kind of profile piece that was in the Armory newsletter, and I'll show you some of the newsletters as I go through this presentation. But as a way to kind of keep up morale and inform different people who worked at the Armory about who else was working there, they would do these profile pieces and talk about people's interests other than what they were doing at the Armory. So this was actually in the Armory newsletter, and it's about this woman who was a harpist and a singer. And, you know, her name is Willette Williker, and there was this whole piece about her. And this was not the only piece like this one in the Armory newsletter. So there were all kinds of things. So people with all kinds of hobbies were featured. But that was sort of how I came up with my cast of characters. So you can see this was like just a representative photograph of 2 women. And so this would be, in my head, this was my cast of characters that I was starting with when I wrote this book. There were the 2 sisters from Brooklyn, this commanding officer's wife, and then the singing cook at the Armory cafeteria. So I first went to visit the Armory in the summer of 2016, after my first book came out, and I was starting to work on this second book. And this is a photograph of the front gates of the Armory during World War II. It looks like this still, actually. There aren't guards there anymore, and it looks a little bit shabbier now. But it actually is, when you see this picture, I don't know about you, but I think it looks like a college campus. Maybe that's because I've been on too many college campus tours with my kids. But it looks very collegiate to me. And it actually is a college campus now. Springfield Technical Community College has taken over the Armory campus. So that's what's there now. There is a museum that's the original arsenal, and some of the buildings like the commanding officer's house and a few other buildings are still there. But most of the buildings have been taken over by the college, but it still really looks like this when you go there. And this is another just photograph of the commanding officer's house. This was in the wintertime. When I went to visit the Armory, I met with Alex McKenzie, who's the curator of the Armory Museum, and he took me to the commanding officer's house. And it looks like this inside. The furnishings aren't there. So these are the furnishings circa World War II. But it was a really, truly elegant house. And when I saw these photographs combined with sort of walking through the place, it helped me figure out some of the scenes in the story. And when I looked at this home, I immediately thought of the parties that I had listened about in the interviews that I listened to with the commanding officer's wife. And when you write a story, it's always nice if you can bring a lot of characters together in one room and sort of throw them at each other and create drama. And that was what I felt when I walked through the commanding officer's house, that this was where I was going to have a lot of my drama. So there are these meetings where the women get together. There's a very kind of mean girl character named Grace Peabody who stirs things up among the other wives at the Armory, the wives of the other officers. And walking through the commanding officer's house helped me kind of figure out how some of those scenes were going to go. I was also really lucky that I got to see firsthand the home where my character was going to live. So when Ruth goes to the Armory, and she's the wife of an officer, they have 2 kids, and they live in a 2-family house, which makes me laugh because my first book was called The 2-Family House. But this is what that house looks like today. So I took this photograph actually. And so this was building 5/6. So 2 families were living in this building at the time. And they were kind of like mirror images of each other. And there were even half of it, I was able to go inside, was really elegant and really spacious. There was a big, you can see, like a big front porch, but there was a big living room, a sort of parlor with a fireplace, 3 bedrooms upstairs, 3 or 4 bedrooms upstairs with fireplaces in 2 of them, a kitchen in the back, just a very kind of really nice, not barracks type housing at all. And so when I saw this building, and I sort of even looked at it from this point of view, it helped me to sort of figure out what my character Millie might have been feeling when she goes to visit her sister Ruth for the first time. So in the story, I'm not sure how many of you have all read it, but in the story, the sisters have various issues with each other, and Ruth ends up moving to Springfield with her husband, who is a scientist and works at the Armory, sort of in development. She moves there early, and when Millie comes, they haven't seen each other for 5 years, and Ruth has a very comfortable life. She lives in this, nice home, and everything is hunky-dory. She's very solidly, middle class and has certain, luxuries. Millie, though, has lost her husband. She is scraping by barely. She doesn't have a lot of friends. She arrives in Springfield with not even 2 pennies to rub together. And it made me, I just was trying to imagine, what would it feel like if you were struggling so much? Your sister never offered you any kind of assistance. And then you finally go to stay with her and you see that she's living here. It would have been pretty shocking to me. It would have been pretty upsetting to see this beautiful home. And I know it was even more beautiful back during World War II days, and see that this is where she was living and she never offered to help. So research can really, when we think about doing research for a novel, we think about, all the facts that we learn and all the little tidbits and, getting every little thing right. But for me, this kind of hands-on research and being able to visit helped me with the emotional development of my characters too. Not just those details that you kind of stick in as background in the story. This is a picture that I love of just all the women working on the tables. This was what I was constantly looking at this picture when I was writing the story and writing the factory scenes of the women all working together at the Armory. And this is a photograph of the cafeteria. So this was Arietta's domain. This is where she would have worked. And she would have been one of these women back here behind the counter, handing out food. And she was actually cooking it in the back. So she was working, cooking too. But this kind of lunchroom scene was where I sort of pictured her getting up on a milk crate and singing for the crowd. And music was a really big part of the Armory. The Works Progress Administration, who hired all those gardeners to take care of the grounds, also hired musicians. And you can see this is one of the lunchtime concerts that they had. They had concerts constantly. So you can see on this drum, it says WPA for Works Progress Administration. But they were constantly having concerts and other events for the people working at the Armory. Because again, you know, there were thousands of people working there. 40-something% of them were women. And there were so many activities and so many ways that they tried to boost morale for the people working there, and ways that a sense of community was created. And these concerts, that was really part of it. The biggest help that I had in writing this book were these copies of the Armory newsletter. So the Armory newsletter, this is just the cover of one here. It was a booklet that was published once a month for about 3 of the years of the war. So there are maybe like 36 of them or so that exist. And at the Armory Museum, I was able to go through all of them in their library. So I spent hours and hours reading through these booklets. They're like the size of a playbill, kind of. You know, when you get a playbill when you go to see a show, maybe 30 pages inside. They were filled with all kinds of things, just like a treasure trove. So, and almost like, in a way, almost reminded me of like a high school newspaper or a college newspaper, because it was like, it would tell what was going on at the Armory, not just what was going on in terms of like production, but really social things. So there were pages about the sports teams, because there were a lot of sports teams at the Armory. There was a basketball team, a baseball team, a bowling team, the riflery club, which I feature in my story. There were gossip pages with things like, you know, what man from Connecticut has his eye on a young lady in the heat treat department from New York? So there were all kinds of, there were engagement announcements and announcements about bachelor parties and bridal showers and all kinds of things. It was this sort of bizarre, really interesting slice of what life was like. So there were also more practical articles. So this is one, you know, what you should wear. You wear your comfortable low-heel shoes, wear no rings on your fingers. There were cartoons that people who worked at the Armory were drawing. So this is one on, you know, how you can win the war, keep yourself in good health, get a lot of sleep. If you see something, say something, all this sort of stuff. There were poems like this one, which is called The Reason Why. And if you kind of read through it, you'll see it says, for want of a worker, the gun was lost. For want of a gun, the tank was lost. For want of a battle, the war was lost. For want of a war, the country was lost, and all because of an absentee. So this was kind of saying, if you miss a day of work and we lose the war, it's your fault. So there were things like this, all of these sort of pieces to promote a sense of responsibility and for working, and people really took it very seriously. Then there were these articles about spies, you know, it was something that they were really cognizant of, really, really worried about, that especially at defense plants, that there would be a fire, that someone would try to steal the secrets of how weapons were made, or try to interfere with the chain of production so that we couldn't send as many rifles or whatever kind of ammunition to the troops. So this was something that was really, truly feared at that time. And then this is the rifle club that Millie ends up joining, but this is a picture of some of them. There was also, you know, this I thought was funny. There was a Miss Springfield Armory contest. So one of the things that I really couldn't ignore as I went through researching the story was sort of, you know, the sexism that existed, which was very, I don't want to say appropriate, but very not surprising for that time. And so there were pieces like this. If you read this over here, where the Army was awarded the Army Navy E Award for excellence in production. And there was a big ceremony and people were given pins. And this talks about how this captain, presented a pin and said, this ought to be worth a kiss. And she gave him a kiss on his cheek, and he went through the line and everyone gave him a kiss on his cheek. And you see at the end, it says, nice going, Captain. So there were things like that about women that we would not appreciate today, but which were very much accepted at the time. And then this is a great sort of photo montage of the dance, which I talk about in my story, which was the dance that actually happened. One of the really interesting things about doing this research was to see how the city of Springfield accommodated the Armory and all the people that worked there at the time. So the whole city sort of just made itself available because there were all of these extra people in Springfield working there and working, like I said, 24 hours a day. So this dance tried to accommodate everyone. The dance was like from 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in the evening, and it went until like 3 in the morning. And that was because, one of the shifts ended at 11 at night. And if you were on the shift that ended at 11 at night, then you could finish your shift and maybe change and then get to the dance by midnight and still have several hours at this dance. And conversely, if you were one of the people who started your shift at 11 at night, you could go early. You could go at 7 and you could have an evening and have some fun and then go to work. One of the things that was so interesting was the movie theaters were showing movies at 8 in the morning for people who got off of work and worked that 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. When you got off work at 7 a.m., if you didn't feel like going home and going to sleep, if your whole sleep cycle was changed, you could go to a movie at 8 o'clock in the morning. And maybe it felt like 8 o'clock at night. I don't know. But the city was accommodating that way. All the shops, the restaurants, the different entertainment, that was just what they did to sort of make sure that everything was working for the people who worked at the Armory. These are just some more pictures of the dance, which was at the Springfield Auditorium, which I don't know, it was just a really captivating event for me that I wanted to include in the story. And then this is sort of the last little piece of the story that I'll talk about. But there was a really famous concert that occurred at the Armory that they still, hopefully they'll do it again. They kind of do a recreation of it every year. And Benny Goodman came to play at the Armory. And it was part of a radio show called the Victory Parade of Spotlight Bands, which used to travel around the country to different defense plants and different Army bases. And they would bring really famous musicians and they would record a live radio show there and they would broadcast it live. So I've actually listened to this radio show, the actual one where Benny Goodman was, because you can find it, you can find anything on the internet now, but you can find it and listen to it. And you hear the host kind of doing a roll call, and Benny Goodman says here, and his orchestra members say here, and then the announcer says, and the men and women of the Springfield Armory. And there's this enormous roaring rush of people because there were like 5,000 people in the crowd on the grounds of the Armory. And when I read about that concert, it seemed, again, you read these things and you try to fit them into a story, and it seemed like a great time for something very dramatic to happen. And there's sort of a big, I don't want to give it away if you haven't read the book, but there's a big dramatic scene that happens at the end of the story that this concert is sort of the camouflage for, because it's such a big crowd and there's so much noise. So no one is paying attention to a couple people or what might be happening to a couple people on the Armory grounds. And there's Benny Goodman playing his clarinet. So it was a fascinating experience to research this time period and to research this place. I grew up like 15 minutes from the Springfield Armory, but I never visited it until I researched this story. And to be honest, I never really even learned very much about it growing up. I wish that I had, but it was a lot of fun to research, a lot of fun to write about, and a lot of fun to just go back to where I grew up and talk to people about the story. So it's sort of my hope that people, take away this family story, that they get excited about that, about just the different family themes that are in the story. It's called The Wartime Sisters, which was a title that my editor came up with, which I loved immediately because the sisters really are at war with each other in this book, but it's also about this greater sisterhood of the women who worked at the Armory together. And I hope you guys liked it or like it if you read it or haven't read it, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and I can take questions from you guys, and you can sort of ask me anything. I'm going to look in the chat. I don't think I have anything in the chat, but if people want to ask questions, that's great. Whatever you guys want to do.
So Ellen and I have a few questions, and then we'll definitely go to the chat. I think there is a question in the chat, and I think it came to me.
Okay, great.
But first of all, those pictures were fantastic, because now I can see Lillian and Millie, Ruth, and Ariada in the different scenes. Like, now it really brought that to life, because I wasn't sure, you know, in my head I had something going, but that actually brought it to life. So that was great. So we wanted to ask you, in both novels, so we loved both novels, Two Family House and The Wartime Sisters, and in both novels, you focus on the often complicated relationships that women have with one another. So they run that gamut of, like, they love each other, they're jealous of each other, they want revenge, they're loyal. Why do you find that you maybe write about the relationships between women in that way?
So, I mean, I guess I'm a woman, you know. I think it's fascinating, but I mentioned before, you know, my mom was one of 3 sisters, and I don't have any sisters. I have a brother, which people say is probably good, because if I had a sister, she would be mad at me for writing about sisters. But when I was growing up, my mother and her sisters, I just thought they were endlessly fascinating, because there were 3 of them, and it was like such a, I don't know, that it was such a pack, and they
Right.
were all so different, and they loved each other so much, but there was always something, you know, there were always 2 mad at 1. It's just like always, there was always something going on. And
Right.
I think that I was a storyteller even then. As a young child, I was just endlessly fascinated with their relationship. And like, I was the kid, like I would listen in on the phone lines. Like, I always, like when they were talking, my mother would be on the phone. I would be, you know, you used to be able to do that before cell phones. You could pick up the phone and listen in. And
Right.
I would always want to know, like, what was the scuttlebutt, like, who, you know, what was happening with everybody. And I think that maybe just, I don't know, that was part of it. Maybe that was the beginning of it. I also think just writers are, if you don't have that curiosity about people, you're probably not a writer, you know, like, and conversely, like, if you know, if you're ever at the grocery store and you feel like someone is eavesdropping on like a ridiculous conversation that you're having, it's probably a writer. Like,
Okay.
the curiosity for human relationships and emotions is just like, it runs very deep. So I don't know, it's just there in me, and I'm always thinking about it.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask you, well, first of all, I love historical fiction. That's my favorite type of book to read. And I never realized how much research a good author like you does when they write an historical fiction book. You did an amazing job with all the research, and it really was reflected in your characters, because you really got to know your characters because of all the research you did. It was really good. And I also liked when you wrote your book how each chapter was named after a character. And I thought that was a great way of really learning about the character, because sometimes I could read a book and I don't even know who they're talking about, so you really organized it, I thought, really well. And I think it was great.
Oh, I'm glad. I like to do that with characters. I did that in both you know, books, because I feel like, and I kind of like to repeat a scene a little bit sometimes, you know, from the eyes of one and then the eyes of another, because I feel like you never really know what's going on in someone's head. And I try to do that as much as I can with my characters, so that people can really feel what they're feeling, and see things from their perspective, especially when you're talking about sisters or sister-in-laws, like in the Two Family House, to kind of see what it is that's driving people and what's motivating them. Because, you know, you think someone is terrible, but then you realize, well, maybe they're not so terrible. Maybe they just thought of this in a different way.
Right.
So I try to do that as I'm writing.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that with the two family house, I always was planning. I wasn't planning to do it that way. I was planning to just write it, not from different alternating perspectives. But that book was in my head for such a long time before I ever wrote it, that I had so much material before I started writing. I had like very separate, distinct voices for the men and the women in that story. And when I went to try to write it, kind of just with an omniscient narrator who knew what everybody was thinking, I felt like it was such a waste, because I had all of these little snippets that I knew that differentiated the characters, and I lost that when I tried to write it not that way, when I didn't write it from the alternating perspectives. And when I focused individually on each person and wrote it as, sort of close third person for each separate character, it came to life in a different way. So sometimes it's just trial and error, where you do something and it's not working and you just feel it, and when you get it right, you feel it, something just clicks, when you're in the storytelling and you feel that it's the right way to do it.
Right. Well, speaking in terms of Two Family House, but also in Wartime Sisters, I mean, you definitely focus on that, the patriarchy, like the importance of marrying well, the importance of, in Two Family House, having a son. And in both novels, the men are important, but they really take that back seat. Like, they're more of the supporting characters, and the women are the ones who drive the plot. So can you talk about that a little bit? Like, why did you set it up that way?
In the Two Family House, the men are more important than in the Wartime Sisters. And the Wartime Sisters are definitely like second class citizens. Yeah. But I think that's just, that's where I'm focusing my energy. I'm not sure why exactly. It's just, I guess it's just, I find it more interesting to focus on the women. I maybe it's just because I'm a woman and I relate to them more. It's funny because I'm working on a book now that's almost finished, but I have another book. I have kind of like another book that I'm working on right after. And that's a book about a little boy and his grandmother and his mother. And my agent was sending it out. I haven't finished it yet, but she was sending it out to some different editors. And one of the editors said, I can't believe Lynda's making like the main character a boy. Like, she didn't like that. She wanted it to be a girl because he felt like that was what I did. I don't want to ever be trapped into writing just one kind of book or one kind of story. So I thought that was really surprising and like strange to me, because I don't know, I really got into the character of this little boy. So I think it just depends on what speaks to me at the time. But you're right, definitely in these first two books that I wrote, the men are not that interesting. I also think like there are some really crummy men in the Wartime Sisters, especially. Right. That are not terrific. There are a lot of really bad guys in the Wartime Sisters.
Yeah.
I was thinking my grandmother did not have a happy marriage, and my grandfather was a crummy guy. And so he was in my head a lot when I was writing the Wartime Sisters, and sort of some of the crummy things that he did. So I think that was where some of that stuff came from.
Okay. Although in Two Family House, I like Mort and Abe. I mean, Abe
is a total mensch and really like a great guy. And Mort in the Two Family House was the most fun character to write, because he has the greatest arc of change. He starts out one way and he becomes a very different person. Mm-hmm. And he was both of those men were based on like an amalgamation of different men that I've known in my life. And like Mort's grumpy parts were based on certain things. When I was little, and I grew up, like I said, in Western Massachusetts, we were members of this synagogue that was an Orthodox synagogue, though nobody who went there, very few people who went there were actually Orthodox. And it was a very small synagogue and kind of like struggling with members and like losing membership. And they had a minyan every day there. which, you know, it's not every synagogue that has a minyan every day. And a minyan is a group of, you need 10 men to come together and pray. And they used to call my father sometimes to come for minyan. And there was this one man who was like the president of the brother. I don't even know who he was, but it's like every once in a while, and we would get a call from a very grumpy man who would say like, put Harris on the phone. Like, not hello, not how are you, just like, put your father on the phone. And those men like were in my head when I was writing Mort in the beginning. Grumpy men. So
That's funny.
So I was, since you brought up Mort, I was wondering if you were thinking about nature versus nurture between Mort and Natalie. Was that...
definitely, 100%. Because, you know, Natalie, it's a very interesting question, because Natalie is not Abe's biological child, right? She's Mort's biological child. But growing up with Abe as a father and Helen as a mother has given her this confidence to deal with people like Mort, and has made her a very secure little girl. And so she develops this amazing relationship with Mort, who she doesn't know was her biological father. But if she had been raised by Mort, she wouldn't have had that same relationship with him. You know, she would have been raised to fear him and to, you know, just sort of keep her distance from him. And so they wouldn't have had the relationship that they had, that they ended up having. So it's a very interesting kind of thing that goes on between them. And it's what really drives Rose to just this kind of pit of despair, because she feels that she's made this choice to switch these babies when they're born so that she can give her husband a son. And she does that because she thinks he can never love a girl the way that he loves a boy, and he'll never want a girl to be educated the way that he wants a boy to be educated. And then this girl comes along and he ends up having this amazing relationship with her. And when she sees that that decision that she made ends up sort of being for nothing, that just sort of pushes her over the edge.
Yeah.
That was good.
Yeah, it was really good. We do have a question in the chat from Teresa, and she writes, can you talk about your writing routine? What was the best piece of writing advice you received that you still use? And thanks, and can't wait to read both your books.
Thank you. Thanks for the question. So I try to write every day, and you know, it doesn't always happen, but in the pandemic it's definitely happened, because I'm not going anywhere, so I've been writing very regularly. I end up writing at my kitchen table most of the time, even though I made this nice office room in my house a couple years ago in the room over my garage. But I wind up just sitting at the kitchen table because that's where people are. And that's where the coffee is. So I sit at my kitchen table. I do my best writing in the morning for sure. And I sort of peter out somewhere around 3:00. But in between, I might do other things. And depending on, you know, in the pandemic, it's just been so weird because everybody's home and my husband's been home and working from home. So I've definitely been working longer days. My third book is almost finished because I just really wrote it pretty quickly this year. In terms of writing advice, there are two things. The most important thing is the simplest thing, which is, I don't know if it's advice or just kind of a saying, which is that a writer is someone who writes. So if you want to be a writer, you have to write. And that just means you have to put your tush in the chair and just sit and write every day. And so I tell myself that all the time, because it's very easy to just like let that go. And especially, you know, with trying to market your book or sell your book or talk to people about your book, it's really easy to kind of let some of the writing sometimes slip away, but you need to be writing every day. So that is one piece of advice. The other piece of advice that I got that I just tend to think about a lot when I'm writing is, I don't know where I read this, but it was something like, when your character is at her lowest point and you think that she can't go any further, just kick her down a little bit more. Like, so it's just, when things are just at their worst, just make them even worse, which I don't always do. It's not like I'm trying to my characters, but it says something to me about creating drama and conflict and driving the story forward. You always have to be driving the story forward. You can't get complacent. and just, send your character to the doctor for a boring dentist visit. And, there has to be a reason for everything that you do. You have to do everything kind of with intention and with that goal of furthering the story along.
That's great advice. That's really great. So we're almost done with the program. That was a very fast hour. We usually end our programs with a lightning round. Would you like to do that with us? So Ellen, can you put 60 seconds on the clock, please?
Wow.
Okay. So tell me when we're ready, Ellen.
Ready.
Okay. Netflix, Hulu, or Amazon Prime?
Netflix.
What are you currently binging?
Oh, well, I just finished A Discovery of Witches, which is AMC Plus. Yeah, that's based on some books by Deborah Harkness, like a trilogy of books about a scholarly witch at Oxford.
Okay, great. What is your favorite pandemic snack or cocktail?
Oh my gosh, I've been drinking way too much wine. I have to stop. I really like the COVID-19 for sure. And I'm just like a sweets person. I really like sweets. So I like candy. It's terrible. And it was just Easter, so like I was eating a lot of jelly beans. That was
Okay. What character of a book, not yours, or a TV movie series would you like to have dinner or lunch with?
I mean, it is.
I want to have lunch with that woman from the Queen's Gambit.
Okay. That would be really interesting. Well, Lynda, it was really such a joy to meet you today. Thank you so much for taking the time and speaking with us. We had a great time. We loved your books.
Thank you. Inviting me and reading the stories. I really appreciate it. And
Thank you so much. And we can't wait to read your other books.
Yes.
Yeah, the next book is it's almost done, and it's about a matchmaker. It's about a matchmaker on the Lower East Side in the 1920s, and then her granddaughter, who is a divorce lawyer in the 1990s, but like a really bad divorce lawyer because she has her grandmother's matchmaking talents, and so she keeps messing up all the divorces. So it's been a really fun book.
That's fun. Okay, that's great. Well, again, thank you so much. And we want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Remember to go to oceansidelibrary.com to see all the upcoming programs that we have every day. So definitely take a look at our calendar. And we wish everyone well and have a good night. Thank you, Lynda, again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.